This week, we're going to talk about the death and the preservation of Paul. Traditional interpretation holds that Paul wrote the letter to Philippi, Philemon, Colossae, and Ephesus during his 2-year incarceration at Rome. The authenticity of Philemon and Philippians is not in doubt. But as we've already seen last week, there are good reasons to date the letter to Philippi earlier in Paul's career during a probable imprisonment at Ephesus. Ephesians and Colossians, on the other hand, present us with a more difficult conundrum. Ephesians 1:1 explicitly designates Paul as its author, and Colossians 1:1 nominates Paul and Timothy as co-authors, and both letters suggest that they were composed while Paul was in prison. However, on the basis of their language, style, content, and close literary relationship, these two letters are generally viewed by scholars as deutero or second Paul. That is, that while they claim to come directly from the hand of Paul, it is more likely that they were composed by one of Paul's disciples, either while Paul was still in prison or shortly after his death. Similar arguments can be marshalled for the post-Pauline origins of the pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, which purport to be written by Paul after his release from prison. These letters suggest that Paul later revisited his communities in Ephesus, Macedonia, and Greece, where he appointed Timothy and Titus to head the Ephesian and Cretan churches respectively. It's 1 Timothy 1:3 and Titus 1:5. Now, 2 Timothy in particular is written in the style of a last will and testament. Note particularly chapter 4, verses 6 to 8. It claims to be composed by Paul following a second arrest at Troas, 4:13, and a subsequent transportation to Rome, where Paul is again in prison awaiting a further trial. Most scholars now believe that the information about Paul's final years presented in the pastorals is little more than an elaborate invention, and moreover, the vocabulary, literary style, and theology of these letters suggest that they are what we call pseudepigraphic or pseudonymous compositions that date to the late 1st or early 2nd century. The most likely scenario is that Paul was executed in Rome either in 62 or 64. The later date is sometimes preferred since it coincides with the start of Nero's persecution of Roman Christians. The later date was assumed by 2nd century patristic writers, especially Clement of Rome, although he claims that both Peter and Paul met their deaths together in Rome. Now, I've discussed this story elsewhere, and we may get into this in the lecture. Paul did go to Rome. There's no doubt about that. That much is certain from his letters, and it's confirmed by Acts, whatever its historical issues. The canonical documents, 1 and 2 or 1st and 2nd Peter, suggest a link between Peter and Rome. Only Clement brings the two together in death, placing them together as martyrs whose blood fertilised the growth of the church, and by implication, whose deaths in Rome constitute a dual apostolic foundation for the Holy See. The preeminence of Rome probably emerged in early Christianity not as a result of either Peter or Paul's association with Rome, but because of its geopolitical significance as the imperial capital. Already in Luke's Acts of the Apostles, the city of Rome is seen as the destination of all early evangelization, which is why Paul's story ends with him preaching in Rome. With Paul's arrival in Rome, the focal point of Christianity in Acts shifts from Jerusalem and its temple to Rome and the Imperium, from Judaism to Christianity. For Luke, a citizen of the empire, it was Rome, not Jerusalem, which was seen as the centre of the world. Ferdinand Bauer, a 19th century scholar, famously argued that the tradition of Peter's visit to Rome is little more than a pious fiction of a later generation, meant to mythically underpin Rome's historical claim to preeminence. Whatever the value of that argument, it's interesting to note that the same is partly true of Paul, who, while he did historically minister and die in Rome, it still emerges in the pseudo-Pauline texts that Paul is the guarantor of orthodoxy. The purpose of these pseudepigraphal or pseudonymous letters, all of which most likely originated in Rome, was to maintain Paul's authority as the guarantor for what would later be called the deposit of faith. It is in these letters that we see the emergence of the notion of apostolic tradition and succession. Moreover, what emerges from these letters is what Victor Furnish called the Paulus Bild, a new exalted view of Paul as apostle and martyr whose sufferings are said to have completed Christ's affliction and to have been like Christ's own on behalf of the whole church, as the author of Colossians and the author of Ephesians say. In Colossians, Paul is idealized as the primary minister of the Christian message, and his teaching as the measure against which all other teachings are found to be nothing more than mere philosophy and vain conceit, as the author says in 2:8. However, the Christology of Colossians is a far cry from that expressed in Paul's genuine letters. In Colossians, Christ is equated with the Jewish notion of wisdom, the Sophia, pre-existent and divine. And there are clear links here to later thinking that we find, say, in the prologue to John's Gospel. Ephesians similarly develops the theme of Paul's ministry, but his ministry is equated with that of the other apostles who emerge as the foundation of the church. Paul thereby is reduced to an archetypical exemplar of apostolic authority. There remain some echoes of Paul's earlier polemic against the law and boasting in Ephesians 2:8-9, but it's only a mere echo. Compare that to what we find, say, in Galatians 2:15-3:14 or Romans 3:20-4:6. Paul has been thoroughly domesticated. The stress of conformity has been further highlighted by an extended discussion of the roles and duties pertaining to the members of God's household, the so-called household codes in Ephesians 1:15-2:22, 5:21-6:9, and Colossians 3:18-4:1. In Ephesians, ecclesiology is stressed over Christology. The cosmic dimensions of Christ, as expressed in 1:17-19, underpin and point towards the cosmic nature of the church. And in both Colossians and Ephesians, we find the first calls for Christians to live within the social structures of Greco-Roman society. In these letters, we see the Pauline movement, which began as a radical sectarian form of accommodated Judaism, maturing as a conservative religious movement. Paul's communities had always looked more like an extended Roman household rather than the synagogue. This was especially the case in Corinth and Rome, as we'll learn in subsequent weeks. Paul's extensive greetings and discussion of disputes in those two letters suggest a domestic model of small house church. By the time of Colossians and Ephesians, these communities have taken on more formal structures, a process that is even more obvious in the pastoral epistles. Like Colossians and Ephesians, the pastorals are pseudonymously written in Paul's name and seek to perpetuate Paul's authority and heritage. Unlike the pseudo-Pauline texts, the pastorals depict the apostle establishing a hierarchy of ministerial orders, proper ordination procedures, and the rules for a succession of leaders to guide the Pauline communities in the absence of their founder. Written long after the demise of the original charismatic communities of Paul's era, much effort is spent by the author or authors of these letters in outlining the credentials of these church officials. These officials are charged by the author, writing in Paul's name, with teaching sound doctrine by preserving Paul's version of the gospel. Like Colossians, the pastorals contrast this sound doctrine with other false teachings, which are viewed as posing a serious threat to the deposit of faith left by Paul. Along with the stress on soundness of faith, faith practice, instruction, and the safe transmission of tradition, there is a concomitant emphasis on ecclesiology, church order and structure. Timothy and Titus are presented as monarchical bishops with authority over the Pauline churches, which they exercise in Paul's name. There is here an emerging hierarchy with a three-tiered structure of elders, overseers, and deacons. Clearly, we can see here the lines of evolution. There is, in the pastorals, a far more developed model of church polity that probably owes more to the Roman legal practices. This would seem to indicate a movement whose primary goal was to assimilate the communities into the wider Greco-Roman society by appearing to conform to the moral and religious codes of the status quo. In the process, though, something of the genuine Paul has been lost. And this brings us to the concept of the myth of Paul. Instead of highlighting Paul's unique contributions to Christianity, the pastorals hail Paul as the preeminent apostle, whose faithful endurance and righteous living is the model for all Christian living. This is a far cry from Paul's own self-abasement as the least of the apostles in 1 Corinthians 15, 9-11, and his gospel proclamation of a radical freedom in the spirit that we find in 1 Corinthians 1:18-2:16, or even more strongly in Galatians 3 and Romans 12. Furthermore, in the pastorals, Paul's gospel is rendered down to a mere appeal for strict adherence to sound doctrine and godly living. And Paul is himself reduced to a guarantor of apostolic doctrine and the ideal Christian man. Something Furnish makes the point of in his article. At the hands of these, his later disciples, Paul's story becomes hagiography, and his memory is invoked only to press conformity upon the pew warmers. The man has become the myth, the prototypical convert, the exemplary Christian, the model martyr, the only one of the apostolic pillars of the church. The radical champion of a Christianity without boundaries, a law-free Christianity, has become the reactionary heresy hunter and the proponent of orthodoxy. Fortunately for us, though, as we'll see in coming weeks, many of Paul's authentic letters did survive. Collected and cherished by the generation after Paul, they became the basis of the Christian scriptures, and they remain for us windows upon the world of our first ancestors in faith. Reverberating through the passionate lines of Paul's correspondence, we hear the echoes of those distant battles that shaped Christianity and that defined the fault lines along which future battles would be fought.